All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Chantal Roy, Director of Membership Services at St. Joseph Media. Thank you all for joining us on this beautiful but chilly Thursday evening for our virtual TL Insider Pie Baking Masterclass with Lorraine Hawley, founder of Mabel's Bakery and Chief Production Officer at Fresh City. Some quick housekeeping notes. Please make sure to ask any questions you may have or leave any comments in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I will be happy to relay those questions and comments along to Lorraine throughout the entire class. So I hope you all have your ingredients ready to go. And now I'd like to introduce Lorraine, who will get the class started for us. Now take it away, Lorraine.
Hi, everyone. Just want to confirm with Chantal that I'm unmuted.
You're good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Welcome to our pie baking class tonight. This is my absolute favorite thing to eat, as well as to make. So I'm very excited to share this with you. As Chantal mentioned, I'm the founder of Mabel's Bakery, and the pies are something I've been baking since I was a wee lass, and hopefully I'll teach you something a little bit different about how to bake pies. So I have a pie that I made last night in the oven, so we'll be able to see what it should look like as it bakes, because we don't have time to make a pie, cool a pie, and look at a pie. But we'll get started here with the crust. So the one thing I love about pie is just how simple it is. It really is easy as pie, although it does tend to have a bad rap about how difficult it can be and how much people struggle with it. And there's a lot of information on the internet about how to get a nice pie. But the reality is pie is for lazy people. This secret to a good pie is just to not overwork it. And I've never, ever had any great success with doing it in machines. It's just always best if you do it by hand. So if you're ready, the first thing you need to do is remove any rings, because you can see instantly if you're wearing any jewelry on your hand, it's going to get covered in flour and butter and all sorts of yummy things. And the one tool that you need that I didn't mention in the recipe is a tea towel or a rag or a cloth that you really don't like, because it's also going to get quite disgusting. So we get started with, I have 2.5 cups. I have an organic all-purpose flour. And I've got my hands in it for no reason other than it feels wonderful and reminds me of beautiful sand. I'm going to put in a pinch of salt. If you're using unsalted butter for the fat, then don't add any salt. The salt isn't completely necessary if you're trying to lower the sodium in your diet. It isn't completely necessary, but it does add a little je ne sais quoi, makes the dough just a little nicer. So just incorporate that. You can use a spoon, but like I said, I like to actually get my hands in there and play. So before we started, I measured out 1/2 cup of shortening. This is an organic shortening that is available at Fresh City. Organic shortening is a little bit hard to find, but it is available online at Fresh City. And then I've measured out 1/2 cup of butter, and this is an unsalted butter. But like I said, if you only have salted, just go ahead and use your salted and then reduce or eliminate the salt in the first step. And we can talk a little bit about how we go on the different types of fats you can use. So I don't know how well you can see that a little bit. I'm coating that in flour, this little lump of shortening. I'm going to work that in first, because the shortening gives the tenderness to the crust and the butter gives the flavor. You can, of course, use lard.
Lorraine,
Yes.
we have a quick question for you. So I think a couple people were wondering what's actually in the bowl. I think there were a few maybe little steps or that they might have missed. So what's actually in the bowl? And just a note for everybody, we are recording this event. So we will make sure to share anything that you miss. If you're not making the pie right now along the way, that we will share the recording with you. But please, yes, keep asking the questions. What's in the bowl?
So what I put in the bowl first was the all-purpose, the 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour. Just an all-purpose white unbleached flour. And then I've added in the salt that we mixed in by hand or with a spoon, and then my little lump of shortening. And then I'm going to use this tool, which is I love this tool. It's just a pastry cutter. They're available at any hardware store usually, or a kitchen supply place. They're less than $5. And until your kids get at them and start playing with them, they'll last you for years. So just mashing the shortening.
How much salt are you putting in there?
A pinch, I would say it's a quarter teaspoon.
Okay.
This recipe is going to make a base plus your top. So it's 2 pie dough balls, your base and your top, and it's about a quarter teaspoon of salt.
And should the butter be at room temperature or cold?
So I had it in the fridge and I brought it out about 20 minutes ago. You will see often online, you'll see people talking about freezing it or having it super, super, super cold. I don't find that, as long as you don't over incorporate it with the flour. And by that, I mean really squishing it in. You want to create little layers of fat and flour so that the fat can bubble up and create that flakiness. So it's cold, but not super, super cold, not frozen. So the butter you can see, it's pliable, almost like Play-Doh, but it's not leaving any greasy feeling on my fingers. And like I said, it's been out for about 20 minutes. So I find straight from the fridge, it's a little bit difficult to work with, but it is true that if it gets too warm, you can easily overwork it and you'll end up with more of a shortbread kind of crust.
So right now in the bowl, there's just the butter, correct?
Right now in the bowl is the shortening. I like to start with the shortening. Okay. I like the shortening in smaller little bits. So I like to do that first, and then I'm going to add in the butter. So same thing with the butter. I'm going to cut it with my pastry knife or pastry cutter, just to get it into big chunks. So I've got big chunks like sort of like this. And then I'm going to put this away. And I'm going to do the rest by hand. I'm tossing it as I go and just breaking up the biggest pieces with my fingers, breaking them. You want a little bit of incorporation with the flour, because otherwise you'll get a lot of fat bleed, and you'll get a greasier crust, and the fat will leak out into your oven.
And for anyone who's, I'm wondering if they can get the ingredients list. We did share it in the email, but if you missed it, Fresh City actually just shared it as well. The link is right in the chat box here. So you'll see the link with the recipe and ingredients that you can follow along the way as well. So if you don't have the tool, the pastry cutter, would you suggest any other tools that you can use?
I would use 2 butter knives to cut it up. I would actually put it in my hand and cut through like this, and then I would finish it by hand.
Thank you.
So the shortening, your end goal is to get smaller than peas in size, and the butter, your end goal is to get hazelnut or chickpea size. So I don't know if you can see, I've got a few pieces, I've still got a few bigger pieces I'm working on. And this will mess up your hands as well as your kitchen, but that's the price you pay for good pie. So as I was saying earlier, you can use lots of different fats. If you are into lard, you can use lard. You can use 100% butter. If you use 100% butter, you're going to get lots of flavor, but your crust is going to be a little bit crisper. You won't quite get the flakiness that you will with a lard or a shortening. If you're making a savory pie, you could use different animal fats like beef tallow or lamb tallow, but those fats tend to give a little more flavor, whereas pork lard is very neutral. So you can use that quite easily in a sweet crust.
Lorraine, do you ever use cake or pastry flour?
Not in a pie crust, no. No, you in order to maintain that tender flakiness that you're going for, you want all-purpose is your best bet. So I really only use cake and pastry if you're making like a light, fluffy cake. You need a little bit more gluten than is available in the cake and pastry flour to hold together and react nicely with the fat as it's baking. So I'm done here. You can see I've got some bigger chunks, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. I'm going to put a little hole in the bottom just so I can actually see the bottom. Make a cloud of dust. And then we're going to work on our liquids.
And can you explain the difference between lard and shortening?
So shortening is a vegetable product. It is most often from palm oil, sometimes from soy, but it can be from any vegetable. It's a vegetable oil. So if you wanted to do a vegan crust, you could do 100% shortening. And lard comes from pigs, typically near the belly, where you get the most beautiful neutral fat. And lard is what people would have historically used. So in terms of how they work in the pie, it's very similar. They both have a beautifully high melting point, so they stay nice and firm. And as they heat up, they create these pockets and bubbles that rise up and give you the beautiful flakiness you're looking for. I'm going to try to slow down. So our next step, if everyone's got their, so thank you for that feedback. If everyone's got their flour and fat ready to go with their hole in the center, we're going to crack one egg. Unlike in other baking, it doesn't matter if this has been out at room temperature or if it's straight from the fridge, because it doesn't need to blend in the same way it would into cookies or cake. So just cracking an egg. Whisk that up in my Pyrex with a fork. And it's important you do that into your measuring cup, because we're going to actually add water straight to the egg and fill it up to the 1 cup mark. So for this, we want cold water. Cold, I have it on the hot side. Cold tap water is as cold as you need it to be. So just let it run for 20 seconds or so. Nice and cold. And then fill your cup with the egg in it. I don't know if you can see that, to the 1 cup line. So it looks a little, well, like a raw egg floating in water. And give that another stir. To this, you're going to add your acid. We're going to use vodka, because that's what I have on hand. You could also use a vinegar. You can use any neutral vinegar, just a white vinegar. An apple cider vinegar will work as well. So what the egg does to the crust is just make it a little bit more malleable. But if you want to make this whole pie vegan and go with 100% vegetable shortening for your fat, you can eliminate the egg. The crust will be a little bit more difficult to work with, but it'll still be beautiful. So I've got this, I've added a teaspoon and a bit of vodka. And I'm going to pour 2/3 to 3/4 of it directly into my little hole I've made.
Lorraine, can you confirm how much vinegar you put in there?
I'm supposed to put in 2 tablespoons. Yeah, I put in 1.
And it's 2 eggs or 1 egg?
It's just 1 egg.
Just 1 egg.
So the second egg in the recipe is to, for one of your final steps, to make to give it an egg wash, just to give a nice brown crust. So it's all wet in here. You're going to, with your hands are going to get quite goopy at this stage. You're kind of going to toss it in, the flour into the water. Your hands are going to look like this, and that's fine. What you don't want to do is be squishing the dough together with the flour. because you'll overwork it and you won't have the streaks of fat that you need to give you a good crust. So I'm going to start. Sorry.
You poured everything, right? From the
No,
cup?
I did about 3/4 of it. So I've got about a 1/4 cup left. You'll find, based on the time of year or the exact brand of flour you use, that you might need more or less moisture. I can see that I've got plenty with that 3/4, and the egg that I'm missing and the little bit of vodka that I'm missing aren't going to hurt or alter this. That's the great thing about pie, is it's, unlike a lot of baking that's very precise, pie you can play quite a bit with. But in an uncontrolled environment, if you're in the summer, you're going to use less liquid, and in the winter or with a different type of flour or brand of flour, you might use a little bit more liquid. I like my pie dough wetter. Then I'm just giving it a little knead here. That might be hard for you to see. Wetter than some people might like it, or that when you see that on, like you can see that's really, it's quite shaggy, and I'm not going to work that other than a little bit of ball. I'm not squishing, I'm just gently forming a ball.
Lorraine, would you mind just recapping those last couple steps for everybody?
So I added in that 3/4 of the liquid that I had measured out.
And what was in the liquid again?
It was the water, the cold water, the beaten egg, and my acid. So that could be a vinegar, a neutral alcohol, any neutral vinegar, any neutral alcohol. These little bits that are coming off my hands, we're probably not going to use. This is what our balls look like. You should have 2 reasonably equal size. The bigger half you're going to use for your base, and the top half we're going to use for a crust. It should look quite shaggy and be quite moist, but not sticky. The sticky bits are on my fingers are from the tossing.
Marion asked, if you're using your hands, are you warming up the fat a little too much? Like, how much can you really play with the dough?
I don't find that you do. It's more the time that you spend with it and how much. When I find that people overwork it, they really are kneading in and getting much more. That's when it's more the kneading. It's not the temperature of your hands so much. It's the pushing and kneading, as opposed to just gently folding and stirring and letting the ball form naturally from the liquid and the flour mixing together. So I am going to throw this in the fridge just for a few minutes. I would sometimes work with it straight from here. It's still cool to the touch, but if I put it in the fridge, it will be a little bit nicer when we go to roll that up. So I'm going to throw that in the fridge, and then we'll work on our filling, and I can answer any other questions you have about the dough. That doesn't fall out. One tip when working with flour is never ever use a wet cloth to wipe it out, or you make glue. So on to the fruit, the filling. We've got the bumbleberry pie I chose. It's a great way to use up any residual bits of fruit you have, any fruit that's starting to go, whether it's little remnants you have in the freezer from smoothies you plan on making, or apples that are starting to look a little mealy. It's a great way to use up those things. So in this bowl, I have 2 cups of apples. I used an organic ambrosia apple, which is a lovely balance between crisp and a little tart, but it's still got a nice amount of sweetness, and it's not so soft that it'll get super soft. I would also do a mix of apple. You can really use any apple you would like. Even a lot of people malign the Macintosh, but it'll give you more of a soft texture for sure when your pie's done, but it'll still be delicious.
Are the apples peeled, Lorraine?
So I peeled the apples. This was about 3, a little less than 3, because if you're not snacking when you're cooking, it's no fun at all. So it's a little less than 3 minus about a 1/4 that I ate. and I diced them into this size piece. So peeled, cored, diced. I had a cup of cherries, a cup of blueberries, a cup of raspberries, and then I didn't have any strawberries, so I added a cup of an organic berry mix that I had. Because it was heavier on raspberries and cherries rather than rhubarb, because there aren't rhubarb, I did drain a little bit of the water. I drained off of the juice from the fruit. You can leave it in by all means. Your pie will just be a little bit runnier. And I'll just drink this later with some soda water, and it's delicious. But you can really use any fruit that you like. You could even put a little mango in here if that's what you've got kicking around. I love making it with rhubarb when rhubarb's in season. Any remnants, just as long as it adds up to about 6 cups. If you increase or decrease your apples, you might want to adjust the thickener. But I mean, the beauty of pie is it's really not supposed to, if it looks homemade, it looks more delicious. So if it comes out a little runnier, a little firmer, it's still going to be delicious. So
and is it okay if the fruits are frozen, or they should be at room temperature?
They can be frozen. You'll probably need to add about 15 minutes to your cooking time. And I would add about half a tablespoon of, in this case, I'm using tapioca starch. So I would add about half a tablespoon of tapioca starch as a thickener. Tossing those and setting those aside for a sec. I have half a cup of sugar. This is just a standard granulated sugar. It's really important, however, to add in your thickener to the sugar so that it distributes evenly and you don't get clumps of almost like a gelée or or jello clumped into your pie. So you want to add your thickener. This is 1 tablespoon of tapioca starch.
If you don't have tapioca starch, would you suggest anything else?
Yeah, cornstarch will work beautifully. You would need to use half the amount of cornstarch to get the same result as tapioca. You could also toss it in some flour. I would actually double the amount of flour if I was tossing flour in here for a thickener. And if you wanted to use arrowroot or potato starch, you could use those as well. I like tapioca with berries because it adds sort of a beautiful sheen to the berries, but the thickener, in terms of the flavor, all of those thickeners will work beautifully and they'll hold beautifully. You just need to adjust a little bit the amount. So the most common two would be tapioca or cornstarch, and cornstarch, you replace at half the amount. So if it's a tablespoon of tapioca starch, you'd use a 1.5 teaspoons or half a tablespoon of cornstarch. So that's all mixed together, my sugar and my tapioca starch. Just dump this on top of the fruit. Toss that together. You can see that a lot of juices have still come out of the berries. But that's going to all firm up when it's in the oven. Some will sneak to the bottom and create that beautiful layer of pastry, that sweetness at the bottom of the pie. Just toss that together. We'll set that aside for a minute and get back to our dough. So I work with a lot of flour when I roll it, just to ensure that it doesn't stick. And because I've left my pie dough a little bit wet, it's going to pick up some of the flour and get some structure from that. It just gives me a little bit more flexibility when I'm playing with the dough. And I should have probably waited till after I pulled the dough out of the fridge, because now my fridge is going to have handprints.
So typically, how long would you leave the dough and put it aside? Is it just what you just did right now, or would you recommend to let it sit a little longer?
Honestly, just what I did right now, I would do 10, 20 minutes. If you leave it in, it starts to get hard and then you have to let it sit to warm up again. So 10, 20 minutes. You can for sure do it ahead and leave it in and then just warm it out on the countertop for, I would say, 20, 30 minutes before it'll be malleable enough.
And for the apple slices, would you recommend they'd be a little thicker or thin when you cut them?
That is totally dependent on how you like them to be. So the thicker they are, the longer they're going to take to cook. But if you like a little toothiness to the apple, then make them a bit thicker and go with the same cook time. I like them to integrate a little bit more. I like them soft. So I cut them fairly thin.
And you haven't added any lemon to the fruit yet, correct?
I have not. I could have, but I was just going to do that at the very end. So you can see my dough, you can see some chunkiness. And I've just patted it into the flour and flipped it over. So there's lots of flour on the surface. And then I'm going to flour up my rolling pin. And just with even pressure, I've got a French rolling pin here, but any kind will do. If you're in a pinch, you can use a round olive oil bottle, anything that's round, just gently and evenly. And I like to turn the dough and keep moving it so that I know it's not sticking to my bottom. Roll it into a round shape. I'm gonna go a little bit, obviously, on my pie tin, I want it to drape around the sides and fold over the edges, so I need to go a little bit bigger.
And the size of the pie, what would you say would be your typical size of your pie plate?
So this one is a 9-inch. It's not quite a deep dish. So it's going, if you had a deep dish, this filling will sort of fill it flat, and this one's going to mound up a little bit. So it's just a classic glass Pyrex. So this looks pretty good in terms of size. What you're looking for here is an evenness. You can roll it thicker or thinner. The thinner it gets, obviously, the more delicate it is, but it's your personal taste. And for the bottom crust in particular, you can always patch it. So don't worry too much about little cracks and tears.
So glass versus metal or any other type, do you think it makes a difference with the cooking time or the way the pie will turn out?
I think it doesn't make much difference in how the pie turns out, but it does change the cooking time. Certain pans, you'll need a bit longer. Pie, though, I find the time is just a general guide. Everyone's oven's a little bit different, and you just want to go with the time that's given is sort of the fastest it's going to cook, and it might take 15, 20 minutes longer because you really want to judge it by how the juices look inside the pie. I've just brushed it off, not so much that that's necessary, but so I'm hoping that you can see some of the fat, the butter in particular, the color in the butter. You can see that that's not fully blended in, that there are streaks and lumps that have flattened out. And that is what gives you the tenderness and the flakiness, is those streaks of fat. You don't want giant streaks through because that'll just melt off and fry your pie, although there's nothing wrong with a fried pie. But to get that classic tender flake, you want this sort of mottled, streaky butter flour. I hope everyone can see that. That might be a little bit. I'm going to gently, I can pick it up, but the best tool, if you don't do this very often, is just to roll it over your rolling pin. Bring your pie plate to the dough and just roll it back. Where you want to be careful here is you don't want to stretch the dough. If you stretch the dough, you'll get that shrinking. So you're just gently moving it into place. I'm going to leave this overhang because we're going to deal with this when we're trimming the pie band. So I've got a little bit of overhang all the time. If I get a bit closer, you can see that there are this lovely mottled color in your dough, and that means it's not overmixed. If your dough is all perfectly symmetrical and look like shortbread dough, it's still going to be perfectly edible. It's just not going to be as flaky and tender as you might have liked. I'm going to give my fruit one more stir. I'm going to squeeze in a tablespoon of lemon juice. If you have bottled lemon juice, that's perfectly fine. Otherwise, I'm just eyeballing. There's still probably another tablespoon in this lemon that we'll use for something later. And squeezing it right into my little strainer, which I don't think I need again. That one last stir. You can see it's quite juicy at this point. The sugar has brought it even more juice, and that's all good and going to turn into lovely pie dough.
That looks so good. Would you recommend everyone turn their oven on at 425? Or should they preheat the oven right now?
For sure, the oven should be preheated. 425. I find my oven takes 10 minutes to get there. And we've probably got about 10 minutes of work. Sometimes I eat this juice, but I feel like that's not proper for this kind of. Anyway, I've got my other juice. So this is just sitting in here. If you want to have your pie tonight, then by all means cook it. This, after we top it, is when I like to chill it. A little bit more flour. And you can make it the day before and then pop it in the oven the next day. Chilling will prevent that shrinking back of the crust, but it'll be delicious either way. So I've got my second, the smaller half shaggy ball. And same thing, I'm just patting it down into my very generous flour. And I don't need to make this one as big because it's going to go on top. It doesn't need to go down the sides.
Lorraine, would you recommend adding any other spices like cinnamon or anything to the mix, to the fruit mix?
Whatever you like. Cinnamon, a little cardamom. If you want more old school, a little nutmeg. Absolutely. A little ginger, even if you want to sort of kick it up a little bit. In terms of the sugar amount too, I would say that's close to half what you might find in another recipe. I like enough sugar just to bring out the flavors. I don't like a sugarless pie, but not so much sugar that you don't get the flavors of the fruit. If I worry about it sticking, sometimes I'll just flip it over. You have one little sticky spot.
And what would you say the lemon juice does to the fruit?
Just brightens and gives some acidity, just a little bright flavor. If you really like that brightness, you could zest your lemon and throw in maybe a teaspoon or so of zest. You could also use orange if you want that citrusy flavor without being quite so lemony. That would be beautiful too. Or lime, you can really play with it and do whatever meets your fancy.
So you'd say about half of a lemon juice is probably the right amount?
Yeah, a little less than half. It's 1 tablespoon. Depends, obviously every lemon is a little bit different. And it's so little lemon that if you don't have a fresh lemon and you have a bottle of that, well, that is telling me to look at the pie, but we can let that go for a sec. It's perfectly fine in this application, or even a little bit of orange juice if you don't have lemon juice on hand, whatever you had just to brighten up, or you can eliminate it altogether. All it really does is add a little bit of oomph to the fruit. So this is my top. You need, when you're making a two crust pie, to have a little venting so that the juices and steam have some place to escape from. You can do that with just a knife. You can cut a little vent hole. I've got some, I'm going to use a kitty cat or an owl, a little owl cut out. I'm going to cut in the top. And this top one, you do actually want to brush off if you have a brush. You could blow on it as well. As you couldn't obviously do that in the bakery, but if you're at home and it's your family eating it, you just brush it off with your fingers. These brushes are a great tool to have. These are a pastry brush. You could just use a paintbrush from the hardware store. You'll just get a little bit more loss of these hairs, and you'll find the occasional little hair on the top of your pie. But these are super cheap as well and great to have on hand. And kids love to do this part of pie baking. So again, I'm going to roll that over. All this flour on the bottom is great. It'll just help thicken the juice. I'm going to try and center my little owl over the top, which I've done semi-successfully. Got stretched out a little bit there, so try and unstretch them. So you can see the fruit is a little bit domed here. And if this was a deep dish pie, this would be a little bit more flat. You can even go heavier on the fruit. For sure, you'll just have to increase your cooking time. I'm going to get more of the flour at the top. The only reason I'm doing this is because I'm going to put an egg wash on it to help give a darker color. And the egg wash doesn't mix all that well. The flour doesn't look that nice. So if you're not going to do the egg wash, if you're going vegan on this, you could leave the flour on, or you could brush it off and then dust it with a little bit of oil. Oh, I've got some beautiful juices leaking out there. Now we're going to trim the pie. The trimming is going to help press these two layers together so the layers stay together when it's baking, and just make it prettier.
Lorraine, quick question for you. Would you suggest how you minimize fruit shrinkage, especially with apples? Maybe that was Nancy's past experience using apples and pies. Would you say you'd add more fruit than less just to make sure that it doesn't shrink? Yeah.
Yeah. So what we do actually at Mabel's is we pre-cook or par cook the fillings. And then when we're putting it in, you're getting more of a representation of what it's going to look like at the end. You want all that juice because it's delicious. But it's true with an apple pie, I would have it mounded. Like if this was apple pie, I'd probably do 8 cups of fruit and have a nice big mound because it is going to sink down as it bakes. What happens though is when you cut into it, you'll have that layer of, pie, apple, and then you'll have a big air pocket, which there's absolutely nothing wrong with. But if you can avoid that by pre-cooking. So I would just pre-cook it on the stove to activate the starches. We put our apple pie in the oven and we really just roast it in a roasting pan, the filling, for sort of 20 minutes. And then let it cool completely so it doesn't melt your crust, and then throw it in. And then you can have, if you want to really have a flat pie, that'll be your result if you do it that way. We cook all of the fillings, just to make sure we're getting even distribution as well. When we're selling the pie, we don't want to rob someone of a few ounces of delicious fruit filling. So there are a couple of ways you can trim. You can use the dull side of a butter knife and just scrape. You can see me there, you can scrape along. And that will give you a really quite beautiful, perfect trim. You can do that all the way around. That technique might take a little more getting used to. If you like a super thick outside crust, just grab a pair of kitchen scissors. Kitchen scissors are great because you can take them apart and throw them in the dishwasher, or just well clean your household scissors. And you can trim leaving a little bit more trim, and that way you can fold it under and get a really nice thick piece if you like it. Or if you do with a knife, you'll get a more elegant finish at the end. I'm going to finish this with scissors. And I like to save these. I'll show you once we get the other one out of the oven, which we'll look at in a sec, and make little cinnamon snacks out of it. So bear with me one sec while I look and see how our pie in the oven is doing. So hopefully you can see this. So it's starting to get some nice color. My juices, however, are a little bit still thin. I want them to look a little bit jammy.
Do you mind lifting it up just a tad bit so we can see once you're done?
Yeah, I'm just going to try and get some juice out for you so you can see what I'm talking about. I might slaughter the top of this a little bit. So you can see here my juice still looks very similar to how it went in, and I want it to look a little bit jammy. I want it to leave a nice path on the spoon. So I'm going to throw that in a bit more. Oh. That's what it looks like so far. So the crust looks pretty good, but the fruit isn't quite done. And that's why you always want to judge it just by your fruit, especially since how much ovens vary, etc. So to get that nice food, a few options you have for trimming the edge of a pie, and you can look on YouTube and I'll do fancy braids and all sorts of things. You could use some of your trim and cut out and do cutouts all along. But the two simplest things, the first would be just to get a regular fork and press down. Your goal here is just to create a seal. So and that does that beautifully. The other thing you can do is coat your fingers with some of that flour that's all over your counter. And you're going to take your thumb and Peter pointer from your non-dominant hand, and then one of your fingers from your dominant hand. And you're going to pinch, hopefully you can see these together. Create as much as a point. If you want, if you've got some extra dough, you can fold that under. If your finger starts to get sticky, just pop it in a little bit more flour.
And would you have to lower the oven temp if the fruit needs to cook longer? You're leaving it at the same temperature?
Right, in the instructions, so I had it for 15 minutes at 425, just to get some color on the crust, and for the bottom crust to get a little bit more, so you don't have a completely soggy bottom crust. And then I turn it down to 350, and then I leave it there until it's done. So next, it's going to drip again, but that's what it looks like when you do it that way. It's got extra flour in there, you can brush that off. Beautiful. Actually, I'm going to use a little bit of this excess. This is my leftover water that had some egg in it. And a little bit of vodka, that's not going to hurt anything. I'm going to use this to wash the top. I've got another little paintbrush that I use for wet things. And we're painting the top, getting in the corners. All this does is add some nice color. So if you could do it with cream or whole milk, if you were making this vegan, you could do it with whatever your favorite cooking oil is. You could do it with a little bit of melted butter. And if your paintbrush accidentally dips in and gets a little color on the top, that is perfectly acceptable. Just circling back, the pooling, if you have some pooling in some of these corners, I like to just brush that out. Otherwise, you just get a chunk that looks a bit eggy. So there you have your pie ready to either go into the fridge, and you could leave it, I'd say up for 48 hours in the fridge if you wanted to do this on a Thursday for dinner on the weekend. You could do that, throw that in the fridge, a nice cool spot in the fridge, and then pop it in the oven, or you can put this in right away. Like I said, if you put it in right away, you'll just start to get a little bit more shrink on the outside than you like, but it's still going to be as delicious.
It looks beautiful, Lorraine.
Thank you.
So I know a couple people were maybe a little behind with some of the steps. If anyone has any additional questions before she shows us these additional tips, let us know so we can answer some of your questions as you're going.
Just, we don't like to waste food at Fresh City or at Mabel's. So my son's favorite part of pie making is eating the scraps. He likes to eat it raw, which I do not recommend for safety, and just it's not that good raw, but he liked it even more when I made little pie dough cookies.
So someone asked, when would you blind bake a pie crust?
I would blind bake a pie crust whenever I'm putting in like a lemon filling or a pudding type filling. When the filling, the way you cook the filling, is on the stovetop as opposed to the oven. Some people, I would blind bake a pumpkin pie or a custard pie if you want to ensure that your crust is less, is fully, it doesn't have any moist spots. When you bake a pumpkin pie with raw dough, it'll still brown beautifully on the very bottom, but you'll get that layer, which I love, that layer where the filling sort of melts with the crust and it's a little bit doughy. To avoid that, you would blind bake. If you don't like that, you blind bake the pie crust a little bit, and that'll crisp up the crust in advance, and then you can go ahead and do the final bake with the pumpkin pie. But with pudding type pies like lemon, butterscotch, a chocolate pudding pie where you're using this kind of crust, you want to fully blind bake it, because you're not doing any other cooking. Or in the case of meringue, you might just be cooking the meringue, but you're not doing enough cooking to cook the crust. And raw pie dough, other than my strange son, isn't that great.
And again, with the pie, the actual plate, if you're using a metal pan, it means that you don't bake it as long, correct? Or is it the opposite?
It'll usually bake a little faster in a metal pan. Yeah. But again, don't rely too much on what the recipe says. Use that as more of a guideline. A pie isn't so finicky. That's the great thing about it. It's not so finicky that having it, opening the oven door a few times, it's not a problem. So don't rely on what it says. Your oven's going to be a little bit different. The temperature you put it in, it's going to take longer if it goes in cold than if it goes in warm, all of those things. Check your juice. Make sure you've got a nice thickening to the juices, that your juices aren't, on a fruit pie anyway, obviously, that your juices aren't thin, they start to look a little jammy and shiny, and then you'll be good to go.
And Fawn mentioned that her crust, she can't really lift off the counter. So is it too dry? It's falling apart.
It might be a little too dry, but so if you're working just on your base, then do the best you can. If you have a spatula, coat your spatula in flour and gently sort of pry it off and then patch it. So to do a patch, if you've got a little hole somewhere, tear off a piece, wet your fingers with cold tap water, sort of pat it so it's wet, place it over the hole, and then just pat around. And on the bottom crust, it's fine. And then the top, just make it part of the decor. So if you still got your second bowl, I would actually add in a little bit more of your liquid and very gently give it a couple of kneads. Just add in a teaspoon at a time of liquid, knead it once or twice, and then roll through it.
Would you recommend we put on a baking sheet in case it drips in the oven?
That is an excellent point. Yeah, absolutely, because it will drip for sure, 100%. So I wouldn't put it on a baking sheet. Ideally, you put a sheet underneath. The baking sheet, sticking on the baking sheet will change the way it bakes, and you want to get the heat to the bottom to get your crust on the bottom nice and brown. Put the baking sheet on the shelf in your oven underneath the pie so that it drips through the grate onto your baking sheet underneath. So I have that on my notes and I did not say that. So thank you for asking that question.
It's a great tip. Thank you.
Yes. And so if you want for re-rolling, I don't know if anyone's asking about re-rolling. I would re-roll for this because you're going to eat these piping hot out of the oven. You're going to burn your tongue on some hot sugar and cinnamon. You could re-roll this. You could re-roll for a base, but I would never re-roll scraps for a top because it's definitely overworked by the time you re-roll. For the base, it's less important because you've got the heavy liquid holding it down anyway. So these, I usually just cut it into little bits and dust it in butter, but you can use some cutters and do some fun shapes. Make little heart cookies or whatever you have, or just cut this up. Shake off the flour. Melted some salty butter, and I'm using the same brush as my eggs. It's gonna bake, so it's not an issue with raw egg. You guys probably can't see that.
And the salted sugar probably gives it such a nice balance with the sugary pie, right?
For sure. Yeah, this isn't baking butter. I've just used my salted butter from my dish that I would put on my morning toast. And then I've got a combination here. I always keep sugar, cinnamon on hand. No surprise probably that I have quite a sweet tooth. This is a 1/4 cup of white sugar and a tablespoon of cinnamon, and great to have on hand when you need a little something sweet and you can just pop it on some buttery toast. You can do this to all your scraps. And then just pop these in the oven for 8 to 10 minutes at 350. So with your pie or right after your pie, and then give them 4 minutes to cool down and then gobble them up. They don't really hold that well, but they're super delicious straight from the oven. And it's a great way to not waste your pie dough. So my pie in the oven So you can see my pie from the oven. The crust color hasn't really changed that much, but so you can see the juices are just, they're starting to be shiny and they're starting to thicken up. I'm going to give it another 10 minutes and it'll probably be perfect. Now, you want to let a pie cool for about half an hour before you cut into it, even 45 minutes. Otherwise, you'll get it'll run, but like a sloppy pie is still a beautiful thing. So if you want to dig into it sooner, give it 15 minutes so you don't burn your tongue. And dig in. But if you want to have a nice, beautiful slice, I would give it at least 40 minutes after it's been in the oven. So it's still warm, but it's going to hold together a little bit better.
And Kate asked if you ever cover the pie with tin foil to avoid the crust burning.
I would do that if I was blind baking the crust. I would cover just the edges with tin foil, but I wouldn't do that in this case. Because it's not going to get to, well, you can see it's been in the oven for about 40 minutes and it could be in the oven for another hour before the crust would get anything close to too dark. So, so yes, if I was blind baking, because I'm going to bake it potentially twice and I don't want the edges too dark, but not if I'm baking a 2-crust pie. Any other questions? You could also sprinkle some coarse sugar on the top of your pie just before you pop it in. It gives a nice little crunch to the pie and adds a little bit more sweetness.
I did see a lot of questions come in from when you have to bring down the temperature from 425 to 350. I know everyone's oven is different, so it's tough to say exactly when you should do that. But when would you recommend, just about that time?
I would follow that one on the clock. I would set it for 15 minutes. If you don't get to it for 20, it's not going to be harmful. But I would set it for you. The point of that is to make sure your bottom crust gets enough heat that it doesn't get soaked through with beautiful fruit juice before the juices start to thicken. So if you forget to do that, your bottom crust just won't be so as crisp on the bottom. It's not a big deal, but I would set my timer for 15 minutes and do it at exactly 15 minutes. You don't have to open the oven. You can just let it come down to the lower temperature naturally. That's all I would do there.
So tell us a little more how you got into pies. Have you been baking pies since you were little, or was there something that kind of drove you to start making these amazing pies?
My mom wasn't much of a baker. She didn't love to bake, but my grandmother married a gentleman who owned a raspberry patch in Prince Edward County. And I would help her can the raspberries and make beautiful raspberry pies every year. So she taught me how to make pie dough. She probably overworked her crust a little bit. Sorry, Grandma Redner. But I was a bit lazy and I just loved it. My mom, actually, the one thing she liked to make was toffee tarts, which were made with pie dough and then a butter tart-like filling. So she did make those and I made the crust for her as well. But I'd say it was my grandmother who really gave me the love of food and fruit and baking with fruit and baking pies, for sure.
That's so lovely. And Kirsten asked, do you sell this exact pie in Mabel's?
We do in the summer. It's a special that we do from time to time. We would usually do rhubarb. We do it when the rhubarb is in, and you can special order it. Depending on the time of year, it would have different fruit in it. So this time of year, it would be the exact pie, but with cherries. And then if you ordered it in the summer, it would have rhubarbs instead of cherries, just to give I like the bite of, I can eat a straight rhubarb pie. So I like the bite of rhubarb, but the cherries give it a nice tang too.
Awesome. Well, this is it for our time. It's already 6 o'clock. Thank you so much for your time today, Lorraine. This was amazing. Your pie looks so delicious. I can't wait to try it out.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for joining today. If you have any additional questions, I know it's tough when we're in such a big, small room virtually, but we really appreciate it. Thank you so, so much for joining us tonight. And I hope you all enjoy your pies. Please make sure to tag us as well. We would love to see them all on social. So we'll send the tags right now in the chat box. And please share them with us. We would love to see them. So please enjoy your evening, everyone. And hope to see you again soon. Thanks again, Lorraine. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.